Alright Specimen, welcome to Thursday and welcome to our weekly recap of Mythic Plus. We are kind of late, actually, we are a couple of days late on our weekly appointment for the Mythic Plus meta situation. This one will be an interesting week. Technically, not because of Christmas, actually, but because this is the week where the balance tuning has gone live. So, we have some nerfs going the way of certain specs, like Havoc Demon Hunter, just to name one, as well as certain buffs going the way of specs like Windwalker, for example. So we get to see this week the progress, the effects of these changes. But for now, let's talk about how things have gone so far. Then we will check up 1 week from now to see what the balance tuning actually did. We got away from last week's fortified entangling and bolstering, and these were the results as far as the performance in Mythic Plus when it came to the keys. Interesting to see that at the very least now, Murozon's Rise, while it does continue to be clearly the hardest of the keys in terms of completion compared to the rest, it's still growing in terms of success rate compared to the others. It's still far away from the easiness of dungeons like Black Crow Cold or Ataldazar, but now it's getting close to 70%, which is an okay number. It's also no surprise that with the fortified week being done with, we now have the 3 fortified weeks being the easiest and the 3 tyrannical weeks being the hardest. Not too big of a shock, not too big of a surprise. Tyrannical this season is quite out there in terms of gigantic hits, one-shots and very dangerous mechanics, so not too surprising. We can move on to something we used to check for last in previous Mythic Plus videos. This time we do it first. It's the most popular composition of Mythic Plus groups last week in the Fortified Entangling week. With sadness, it is with sadness I point out once more, Augmentation Evoker is dominating the comps together with Havoc Demon Hunter. The third pick is more varied, there are more options. You have Demo, you have the Rogues, you have Fire Mage now creeping up, you have Beast Mastery Hunter, which loses out a bit more the higher the key level. As you start going further down, you will start seeing more and more Beast Mastery Hunters, but at the very most popular level, it loses out to more tanky kind of specs. For tanks, it's Vengeance, followed by Protection, and for healers, not nearly as dominant, is Discipline, followed by Restoration Druid. The requirements of Combat Rest and Bloodlust, as I am contractually obligated to point out every week, are still very high. Look at the most popular comps. You have a comp with Vengeance, Discipline, Fire, Havoc, and Augmentation. There is 0 Combat Rests in this group. Even in this group, Vengeance, Discipline, Outlaw, Havoc, and Augmentation, there is 0 Combat Rests in the group. Yes, I guess some of these will have the scuffed engineering bracers for the combat rest, but it does show that even trying to follow the meta right now, you are in situations where you actually can form groups without 2 of the most or the 2 most important tools you want to bring in Mythic Plus. However, let's move away from just the general look of the specs, of the general look of the compositions, and let's look at something more juicy, like for example numbers. Yes, this will be nerfed, but we'll get to see just how much it will be nerfed. This was last week. We're not still looking at this current day because there are not enough logs yet for this new week. We can go back and looking at the end, the full week that we just went by in Fortified. So the numbers here still continue to show a very nice, a very even and pleasing to look at curve, starting with red. It goes down in a pretty balanced and even state. I would say this is an ideal level of balance for the specs. If only these 4 didn't exist. Unfortunately, they do exist, and their damage spikes up significantly more than the rest. That's the continued issue at the start of this season when it comes to damage, when it comes to outliers. What perhaps might be an even bigger problem with these 4 outliers is that they aren't even being nerfed, because the only one who is receiving nerfs is Havoc. Demo, Outlaw, and Beast Mastery are actually not getting nerfed whatsoever in this patch. So that is perhaps a bit concerning as far as damage is concerned. You can also check, just for funsies, the damage done by tanks and by healers. You see Vengeance being above everyone else, even above Brewmaster, who technically does have more damage than Vengeance, but suffers from not getting into nearly as high and as coordinated groups, which often allows tanks to do more damage. For healers, it's a more reasonable competition, but with the surprise of the rising Resto Druid, because we were used to be seeing these two at the top, which are Discipline and Mistweaver in terms of damage. Now Resto Druid is actually creeping quite close. In this patch, we're getting some changes actually. Mistweaver Monk is getting quite a lot of nerfs, but not really related to their damage, more so to their healing. And also you have things like Holy Priests being buffed, but again, not really in terms of damage, so none of this should particularly change for these bottom specs when it comes to damage and when it comes to healers. You have a different look. Rather than just looking at the actual damage they do, maybe something changes when it comes to their actual tier list rating based on the level of keys they are completing, as well as how many of them are completing those keys. Not really at the start, because you continue to see Havoc, BM, Outlaw and Demo right at the top. Of course, the one we are missing in here, which is Augmentation, showing up quite average, is of course showing up as an S tier spec. As we also mentioned in the popularity of the specs, Augmentation is quite present. It's also worth a reminder that the logs from Warcraft logs are still kind of scuffed and broken when it relates to Augmentation, so this is not even nearly as representative of the damage of Augmentation, because this takes its numbers from Warcraft logs, just like this one does and just like this one does, so they are all taking it from there, and in there Augmentation is not really showing up properly. So the 5 or so specs at the top remain the same, continue to remain the same. We will see, of course, related to the balance tuning that is coming right now in this week. For the unawares, this was the balance tuning. You had the nerf to Havoc, the decent buff to Devastation, the set of questionable buffs across the board for all mage specs. You had the biggest buffs of the week, which are going to Windwalker Monk. It's going to be an over 10% buff to Windwalker, in particular in AoE, so we can expect them to rise significantly when it comes to Mythic Plus damage. You had the nerf to healing of Mistweaver, the damage buff to Red Paladin, which will be interesting given that their current situation is right here. They are right below them and they're being buffed by 3%, so that is an interesting development. You have the buff to Shadow Priest's AoE, the buff to Holy Priest's healing, as well as the nerf to Assassination Rogue, following what some shamans are getting excited about, the buff to Earthquake for Elemental, as well as the buffs to the 2 underperforming Warlock specs. So these are the specs we want to be looking at in terms of performance changes as we go deep down in this week. How will Windwalker change based on its current mediocre state? What about the buffs to the mage specs, the nerfs to Havoc Demon Hunter? What perhaps won't change that much are the buffs to Affliction and the buffs to Destruction, the buff also to Devastation Evoker. The only buff it looks like Devastation needs is to remove Augmentation from the game. As long as that doesn't happen, seems unlikely much will change for them, as well as the nerf to Assassination Rogue. Those are the interesting picks in terms of balancing for DPS. For healers, of course, buffing and nerfing the healing done isn't really going to change much in terms of the meta of Mythic Plus, because it is not nearly as relevant. But even if it is not nearly as relevant, even in Mythic Plus, we do still see Mistweaver Monk having actually a gapping actually the other healers in terms of overall healing, which is getting nerfed, as well as Holy Priest getting buffed as well, which is good for them given their state, given their meta. You can see the meta pictured in popularity of the specs as well. As usual, it starts on a nice and even and balanced route at all key levels, with the usual exception of the hipster underplayed Brewmaster Monk, which looks like they are in that position every single time. Then you get into the higher level of keys and you continue to have the dominant presence of Vengeance Demon Hunters. Still though, it is worth reminding that these two tanks are more than used at high key level. You know, even just looking at the absolute highest keys, you actually do see a majority for now of Prot Paladins over Havoc Demon Hunters, for example. That is also a thing at the moment, which is also impacted by the need of a combat res and the want of running a priest. The moment you swap a druid for a priest, it means you lose your combat res, because if these 3 specs are meta, or maybe even a rogue, it means you don't have a combat res, so you're running a Prot Paladin instead. So now you have the combat res with a priest and not a druid, which is part of the reason why there is a resurgence of Prot Paladins in high keys, even though this one shows a massive dominance of Vengeance Demon Hunter. Healers are of course the same. You see Discipline of course, and you see Resto Druid of course. The other one, similar to here, where Blood for example is not nearly as showing up as the other two, is Mistweaver. You do see Mistweaver being tied basically to Resto Druid, but as we keep scrolling down in the very high keys, you start seeing some Mistweavers here and there, but the dominance remains of white and some orange. It's only as you start going further down the keys where Mistweaver starts to become more prevalent and more even with Resto Druid. That is happening for healers, and not really much else is changing. We have gotten the slowing down of Holy Paladin. We started the season with 4 healers being closer to each other. Now more players have given up on Holy Paladin. You know, when even your de facto leader of the spec, Ellesmere, decides to reroll from his Holy Paladin to go and play Mistweaver Monk in high keys, you know, something's going on with the spec in Mythic Plus. For melee DPS, you do have a bad situation. It's at this point, we have to say it's been long enough. We have seen enough of the season. We have now gone through like 5 weeks of the season. It's a bad situation which is reminiscent of what was going on in BFA. Some players might tell you, the ones who played back in the days of BFA, that BFA was dominated by melee. Melees were ruling BFA. There was no room for range DPS. It was a miserable season for a caster in Mythic Plus. The truth is that it's not that melees were ruling BFA. It's that one spec was ruling BFA. In some cases, a couple of specs with Havoc Demon Hunter. So it wasn't nearly as much as the melees dominating the season. It was more like a single spec dominating to the point where people were running double of the same spec in a Mythic Plus key. We're getting something somewhat similar right now, where you have a lot of presence of really just one spec in melee. It's not that melees are doing well. It's one guy that's doing well, and sometimes you can bring your second one. Sometimes you can bring the Outlaw Rogue every once in a while, but for the most part, the only melee that's doing well is Havoc. Everyone else is not having too good of a time in Mythic Plus. Why is that? Well, obviously, if there are not many melees being brought, it's because it's the ranged who are being brought. And in this case, it's not even ranged, it's one ranged, which is Augmentation. So when most of your keys bring in a Havoc Demon Hunter and an Augmentation Evoker by default, there is only one spot left for your DPS. And in many cases, that one spot left will be depending on what your group needs. If you are running the Vengeance plus Priest comp, for example, it means you need a combat rest. So you can bring a Balanced Druid. Alternatively, if you don't want to bring a Balanced Druid, you can bring something like a Demonology Warlock, for example, which is also doing okay. You are bringing Priest and Havoc, you have no combat rest, let's bring a Demonology Warlock. Other times, if you have a Paladin, then you don't need the combat rest, so now you can bring whichever spec you want. This kind of Tetris combination of blocks required for Mythic Plus has brought some strictness to the groups. Not nearly as much. Okay, let's not doom ourselves. It's not nearly as bad as Season 2 in terms of the presence of certain specs, right? It's still going fine right now. You still have plenty of options. Even here, with Augmentation being popular, you still have 1, 2, 3, 4, basically 5 different specs plus Augmentation. That's 6 ranged specs being at close or above 10% play rate in a 25 plus key. That's 6 ranged, and then you have 7, 8, 9, almost 10 different viable in total. 10 different viable DPS specs in keys higher than 25, which are done by 1% of the player base. So to have that level of balance still at that high key level is still quite good. And as a reminder, just in case you wanted to compare, if you go back to Season 2, you have 1, you have 2, and you have 3. And for the melee DPS, don't get baited. It's not 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because the amount of melee, 10,000, was less than half of the amount of the ranged because of the dominance of this comp. If you go back to the balance between ranged and melee right now, you will find 14,000 ranged versus 15,000 melee. So it's completely even and equal. That's much better right now compared to last season. We will get to see now what these balance tuning will do to the specs. Of course, some of these specs, looking at their popularity, looking at their play rate and even their damage, might be wondering why they weren't buffed or changed. Maybe why they weren't buffed or changed. For example, Feral Druid or Frost DK, maybe Marksmanship Hunter or Survival Hunter. But right now, it does look like the situation is even enough, balanced enough to be acceptable. Plus also we get to see now any further changes given from balancing, because even if some specs haven't been touched by this last round of tuning, we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, 5 of the bottom 8 specs right now in Mythic Plus all being buffed. So it is good, it is positive in terms of changes to the underperformers. To finish, the only question perhaps is the changes to the overperformers, because if anything, this spec is being buffed, this spec is being buffed, this one is being buffed, and the only spec being nerfed is this one. Those are perhaps the only question marks when it comes to the balancing around Mythic Plus. Yes, to those wondering, most of the situations due to those buffs and nerfs was due to the raid. So the mages were being buffed not because of their power right now in Mythic Plus, but because of the raid, or like Red Paladin was being buffed not because of their power in Mythic Plus, but because of the power in the raid, which might or might not end up impacting Mythic Plus in a not so planned way. Like for example, turning mages into Flavor of the Month again, as it could happen after the changes. However, for now, this is what we have on this Thursday when it comes to Mythic Plus as we wait the proceedings of this week when it comes to observing the changes from the balance tuning that happened basically yesterday at the beginning of this reset. Very little hope, to be fair, that anything at the very top is going to change. There is going to be more interest in the middle. In the middle about Windwalker Monk, about Shadow Priest, about Devastation Evoker, those type of specs being changed in this new reset of Mythic Plus. So, with these things out of the way, as we're getting very close now to our dear Christmas holidays, we can now say goodbye to each other. We're starting as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I don't know, I woke up and it's like I've been chewing on my cheek for like 3 hours because it hurts. It just hurts.